The word came out of Elsie Kingsley's mouth before she could stop it, raw and broken, and full of everything she had spent 6 years trying to bury. "Choose," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the single syllable landed in the hay-scented air of that Nevada barn like a gunshot. Her daughter Clara stood at the gate of the foaling stall, 8 years old and wide-eyed, her small fingers curled around the wooden slats, staring at the trembling, copper-dark newborn foal who had just collapsed onto its wobbly legs for the very first time. Clara turned and looked at her mother, and in that little face Elsie saw every question that had never been asked, every silence that had stretched too long between them across too many dusty miles and too many borrowed beds and too many towns where they had not been welcome. And behind Clara, leaning against the barn post with his hat tilted low and his jaw set hard and his dark eyes burning with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief but was somehow both at once, stood Peter Stone. He had just told Elsie the truth, all of it, the hidden motive, the dark past. The betrayal she had not seen coming because she had been too busy surviving to notice the trap being laid right beneath her feet. Elsie's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs to make them stop. "Mama," Clara said softly. Peter took one step forward and stopped himself. The restraint of that single step, the way he caught himself, the way his throat moved when he swallowed, told Elsie more than any words he could have offered. "Pick any name for that foal," Elsie said, and her voice broke on the last word, and she turned it into something fierce because she refused to cry in front of him, "because your mama deserves the choice." Clara blinked. She looked at the foal. She looked at her mother. Something in Elsie's tone must have told her this was bigger than a name, because she reached her small hand through the slat and let the foal press its velvet nose against her palm, and she said, very quietly, "I will think about it carefully." And in that moment, with the Nevada wind rattling the barn walls and the foal breathing its new and trembling breaths and Peter Stone, standing in the shadows with his whole truth laid bare, Elsie Kingsley understood that she had arrived at the exact place all the roads had always been leading. It had started, as most terrible and beautiful things do, with a letter. The year was 1883. And Elsie Kingsley had been a widow for 14 months when the letter arrived in the small Kansas town of Harlow's Creek, where she had been working as a seamstress in exchange for a room above the dry goods store, owned by a man named Gerald Potts who smelled of lard and disapproval. The letter was not addressed to her. It was addressed to a woman named Marguerite Holloway, and it had been placed in Elsie's post box by mistake, because someone at the post office had confused the H in Holloway with the K in Kingsley, which was the kind of error that only happened in towns so small that the postmaster was also the town barber, and spent most of his working hours not paying attention. Elsie had opened it without thinking, the way you open something you believe belongs to you, and by the time she realized the mistake it was too late because she had already read the first 3 lines. Those 3 lines changed everything. The letter was from a man in Nevada who was looking for a woman to come work his horse ranch in exchange for wages and a proper house and security for herself and any children she might have. He was not looking for a wife. The letter was specific about that. He was looking for someone reliable and experienced who could handle bookkeeping and general household management, and who would not ask questions about his business because his business was complicated, and he valued his privacy. He signed it P. Stone, Rattlesnake Creek Ranch, Elko County, Nevada. Elsie had sat down on her narrow bed in the room above Gerald Potts's store and read that letter 4 more times. She thought about Clara, who slept in the same narrow bed and who had eaten nothing but salt pork and dried corn for the better part of 3 weeks because Elsie's wages from the seamstress work barely covered the room, and the letters to her late husband's family in Missouri had gone unanswered, which meant they were deliberately unanswered, which meant they had decided that Henry Kingsley's debts died with him, but his widow and his daughter did not. She thought about Henry himself, who had been a good man in the ways that mattered the most but a careless man in the ways that mattered second most, which was to say that he had loved his family deeply and managed money like a man trying to carry water in cupped hands. When the fever took him in the winter of 1882, he left Elsie with $200, a mortgaged property that the bank foreclosed on within 60 days, and a daughter who needed feeding. She thought about Gerald Potts, who had begun standing a little too close when he measured her weekly rent payment, and who had twice suggested, with a smile that was not a smile at all but a threat wearing a smile's clothing, that there were other arrangements they might come to. Then she looked at the letter one more time. She wrote back that evening using the last of her good stationery. She did not explain that she had opened the letter by mistake. She did not explain that she was not Marguerite Holloway. She signed her own name and gave her own circumstances and said that she was 26 years of age, that she could handle accounts and household management, and that she was not afraid of hard work, and that she had a daughter aged 7 who was healthy and quiet and well-behaved, and that she would need to bring the child. She posted it before she could talk herself out of it. 3 weeks later the reply came, this time correctly addressed to Elsie Kingsley, and it said simply, "Arrive by the 1st of September. Wages $5 a month in the foreman's cottage. Tell no one your business." It was signed the same way, P. Stone. She told Clara they were going west. Clara, who was 7 and had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, said nothing for a long moment and then asked if they would see any mountains. Elsie said she expected they would. Clara said all right then. They left Harlow's Creek on a Tuesday in August, traveling by rail as far as Reno and then by hired wagon east into Elko County, and every mile that opened between them and Kansas felt like a breath Elsie had not known she was holding. The Nevada high desert was nothing like Kansas. Kansas was flat and certain, and wore its cruelties plainly where you could see them. Nevada was enormous and secretive, and its beauty had an edge to it, the way a beautiful horse can still kick you into the next world if you do not pay attention. The sage smelled like something ancient. The mountains in the distance seemed to move as the light changed, drifting like great purple ships across the horizon. When the wagon crested the final rise and she saw the Rattlesnake Creek Ranch spread out in the valley below, Elsie felt something move in her chest that she could not name. The ranch was substantial. Not pretentious, but real. A main house built from timber and stone that sat like it had grown from the ground. A long stable with a good roof. 3 separate corrals and a paddock beyond them where a dozen horses grazed. A foreman's cottage set back from the main buildings with its own small porch, just as the letter had promised. A man was standing in the yard. He was tall and broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who does not think about his own size because he has never had cause to. Dark hair under a worn hat. Shirt rolled to the elbows. He stood the way certain men stand, as though the ground beneath him was always exactly where he expected it to be. He watched the wagon approach without moving toward it, and that stillness told Elsie 2 things at once. First, that he was someone accustomed to letting things come to him at their own pace. Second, that he was not sure about her. The wagon stopped. The driver hauled the brake. Elsie climbed down without waiting for assistance and walked to within 10 feet of Peter Stone and stopped. He was younger than she had imagined from the letter. Late 20s, she thought, maybe 30 at the oldest. There was something closed about his face, not unfriendly exactly but contained, like a door that was firmly shut but had not been locked. He looked at her. Then he looked at Clara, who had climbed down after her mother and was now standing very straight with her chin up, which was what Clara did when she was nervous. "Elsie Kingsley," he said. It was not a question. "That is correct," Elsie said. He was quiet for a moment. "I wrote to Marguerite Holloway." Elsie had prepared herself for this. "I know. The letter was misdelivered to my box. I read it. I apologize for the deception in not making that clear in my reply, but I believed my situation spoke better for itself than any explanation would have." Peter Stone looked at her for a long and measuring moment. His expression did not change. "Can you ride?" he said. "Yes." "Keep books?" "Yes." Handle yourself when things go sideways. I have been handling things going sideways for approximately 2 years, Elsie said. I have become rather proficient. Something shifted in the set of his mouth. It was not a smile, but it was the shadow of where a smile might one day lie. He looked at Clara again. What is your name? Clara Kingsley, Clara said. Are you afraid of horses, Clara Kingsley? Clara considered this with the seriousness the question apparently deserved. Not the big ones, she said. Small ones make me nervous because you cannot predict them as well. Peter Stone was quiet for another moment. Then he said, fair enough, and he turned and walked toward the main house, and Elsie understood this to mean they were staying. She breathed out. The foreman's cottage was exactly what he had promised. One large room partitioned by a curtain into sleeping space and living space, a cast-iron stove that worked, a real wooden floor, a window that faced east so the morning light came in clean and gold. Clara ran her hand along the windowsill and declared it satisfactory, and Elsie sat down on the bed and laughed for the first time in so long that the sound surprised her. The work began the next morning. The Rattlesnake Creek Ranch ran quarter horses, breeding and training them for sale to ranchers and cavalry, and the occasional wealthy buyer who came up from San Francisco. Peter managed the breeding lines himself, kept a working knowledge of bloodstock that was detailed enough to impress anyone who knew horses, and had 2 ranch hands, a gruff and minimally verbal man named Caldwell, and a younger one named Joe Marsh who had a gap between his front teeth and a laugh you could hear across 2 pastures. Elsie's job was the books and the household, which in practice meant maintaining the accounts ledger Peter kept in a locked box in the study of the main house, ordering supplies, managing the accounts with the merchants in Elko, and keeping the main house in order on the 3 days a week she worked there, while the rest of her time was her own to manage the cottage and care for Clara. The accounts were a revelation. Not because they were poorly kept, they were meticulously kept, but because they told a story about a man operating under significant strain. The ranch was profitable in the years before 1881. Then something had shifted. Income had dropped sharply. There were payments going out at irregular intervals to an address in Carson City that had no corresponding business notation. The horses being sold in the past 2 years were being sold for below their evident value, based on the bloodlines Elsie could cross-reference in the breeding records. She said nothing about this to Peter for the first 3 weeks. She was observant enough to understand that trust was built slowly on a working ranch, and that a woman who had arrived under something approaching false pretenses had less right to ask questions than most. She watched instead. She watched the way Peter moved through the ranch, the way he checked each horse every morning as if he were personally accounting for them, the way he knew each animal's temperament and history without reference to any notes. She watched the way he spoke to Caldwell and Joe, not with the authoritarian bark of a man asserting dominance, but with a directness that communicated respect. She watched the way he stood at the paddock fence in the evenings, sometimes for a long time, looking at nothing and thinking about something she could not see. She watched the way he looked at Clara when Clara was not looking at him. Clara had decided within the first week that Peter Stone was interesting, which was Clara's highest possible endorsement of an adult. She had begun volunteering to carry water to the stable in the mornings because it gave her reason to be there when Peter was working with the horses. He tolerated her presence without making it into something either of them had to discuss. One morning Elsie came to the stable door and stopped short of announcing herself. Peter was showing Clara how to approach a nervous mare without triggering her flight instinct. He was speaking quietly, precisely, explaining that you move from the horse's line of sight from the left side because that is the side from which they expect approach, because that is how their eyes work, and that you let them smell your hand before anything else because smell is their first language, and they will trust the information it gives them before they trust anything they can see. Clara was listening with the focused intensity she reserved for things that genuinely mattered to her. Why does she keep her ears like that? Clara asked. Which way? Peter said. Kind of flat, but not all the way flat, in between. She is not sure about you yet, he said. They flatten all the way, you step back. When they come up and point forward, she has decided you are all right. Clara watched the mare. After a moment the horse's ears came forward. There, Peter said. Clara's face split into a smile of such pure and uncomplicated joy that Elsie had to turn away from the doorway because something was happening in her chest that she was not yet ready to examine. She went back to the cottage and sat with the accounts ledger and forced herself to think about numbers. The irregular payments to Carson City were bothering her. They were too consistent in their irregularity, if that made sense, which was to say they came at times of stress on the books, when a big purchase had just gone out or when a sale had fallen through. They felt less like business transactions and more like a debt being serviced, a debt without a name. She began, very carefully, to map them. October came with a cold clarity that sharpened every edge of the landscape. The aspens in the creek bottom turned the color of old coins. The morning smelled of frost and sage, and the particular sweetness of horse sweat in cool air. Elsie had settled into the rhythm of the ranch so completely that some mornings she woke and felt, for one confused and beautiful second, that she was exactly where she belonged. Then she would remember that she was here under a misunderstanding, working for a man who had more secrets than she had yet uncovered, and the warmth would recede. But it always came back. She and Peter had developed a working relationship that was professionally correct and personally circumspect, which was the arrangement they had both agreed to without ever saying so. They spoke about the accounts. They spoke about the horses. They spoke about supply orders and the coming winter and the condition of the south pasture fence. They did not speak about the Carson City payments. They did not speak about whatever it was that lived behind the closed door of his expression when he thought no one was watching. They did not speak about the fact that he had twice now, when Elsie was sick with a chest cold in September, left a bowl of soup on the porch of the cottage without knocking and disappeared before she could thank him. The third time she caught him at it. She had heard his boots on the porch and gotten to the door quickly enough to open it before he could retreat. He was standing there with a bowl in his hands, looking as though he had been caught at something considerably more incriminating than soup. You did not have to do that, Elsie said. I was making it anyway, he said, which they both understood was not precisely true since she had heard Joe Marsh complaining that morning about having to boil his own coffee because Peter had not come down to the main house. She took the bowl. Their fingers did not touch. She was aware of the not touching in a way that said more than the touching would have. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and turned and went back toward the main house, and Elsie stood on the porch in the October cold, holding a bowl of soup that was too hot for how it was making her feel, which was, she had to admit, considerably warmer than the soup itself could account for. She went inside and told herself sternly to be practical. She was not always successful. The revelation about the Carson City payments came from an unexpected direction. A man arrived at the ranch in late October, a man named Dorsey Cal, who came with a rifle on his saddle and nothing about him that suggested good intent. He was perhaps 40, lean in the way of a man who has run from something long enough that the running has taken all the extra flesh off him, with small and calculating eyes. Elsie was in the main house working at the accounts when Dorsey Cal rode into the yard. She heard Peter go out to meet him from the parlor where he had been reading, and she stayed at the desk, but she stopped pretending to write. The conversation outside was conducted in low voices. She could not make out most of it. But she heard enough. Cal said something about a debt being overdue. Peter's voice, when it came, was controlled but had an undertone in it that she had never heard before, a compressed and dangerous quality like a spring wound past its tolerance. I have paid what was agreed, Peter said. The agreement has changed, Cal said. Mr. Farrow's terms have changed. Silence. Farrow can put his new terms in writing and send them through the proper channel, Peter said. Mr. Farrow does not believe in paper, Cal said, and she heard in his voice the smile that accompanied that statement. More silence. Then Cal's horse moved and hooves on packed earth and the sound of departure. She heard Peter come back inside. He stopped in the doorway of the study. She did not look up from the ledger. "Whatever you heard," he said, "I would prefer you not to ask about it." "All right," she said. She heard him exhale slowly, as though he had been prepared for an argument. "I am keeping the accounts as accurately as I can," she said, still not looking up. "But there are payments I cannot assign to a category because there is no corresponding notation. That makes the books inaccurate. If you wish the books to be accurate, you might consider telling me what those payments are for, so I can record them correctly." Silence. "They are not your concern," he said. "They are my concern," she said quietly, "because they are in my books and I am responsible for the accuracy of what is in my books." She looked up then. He was standing in the doorway with his jaw set hard and his arms crossed, and she met his eyes directly and did not look away. He held her gaze for a long moment. "They are a debt," he said finally. "From before I came here I am paying it down." "How much remains?" Something crossed his face. Not irritation, something more honest than that. Something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "Enough," he said. She nodded and looked back at the ledger. "I will record them as debt service until you tell me otherwise." He stood there for another moment as though waiting for her to push further, and when she did not, something in the set of his shoulders eased just slightly. "Thank you," he said, and he left. She sat for a long time after that without writing anything, her pen still in her hand, thinking about a man with enough pride to be shamed by an old debt and enough honesty to admit to it when pressed. She thought this was dangerous information to have about someone. She was right. November came in hard and early, the way Nevada Novembers sometimes did, with a ground blizzard that held for 2 days and left everything encased in a silence so absolute it was like being inside a painting. The horses were stabled. Caldwell and Joe Marsh stayed in the bunkhouse. Elsie and Clara were snowed into the cottage with the cast-iron stove running hot and the wind making the windows talk in their frames. Clara had been sick, not the cold that Elsie had dealt with in September, something worse, a deep chest cough that had kept them both awake for 3 nights. Elsie had used everything she knew, the steam over a pot, the honey and hot water, the poultice she remembered her own mother making, and by the second day of the blizzard Clara was improving but still pale and tired. On the afternoon of the second day there was a knock at the cottage door. Peter stood outside with snow on his hat and shoulders, carrying a medical bag that she had not known he possessed. "Joe came through the connecting passage to let me know Clara was unwell," he said. He held up the bag. "I have some supplies. The doctor in Elko gave me these when I had a similar thing 2 years ago." Elsie stepped back from the door to let him in without quite deciding to. He was careful in the cottage. Careful in the way of a man who was aware that he was in someone else's private space and was treating that awareness with respect. He did not let his eyes move over her things. He went straight to where Clara was lying on the bed behind the curtain and crouched down to Clara's eye level with a directness that Elsie had noticed he always used with Clara, treating her as a person rather than a small problem. "How do you feel?" he asked her. "Not excellent," Clara said honestly. "Does it hurt here?" He pressed 2 fingers gently below her collarbone. "Yes," Clara said. He nodded and opened the bag and took out a small dark bottle. "This is a compound the doctor mixes himself. It tastes terrible, but it helps." "Can you manage terrible?" Clara looked at the bottle with the expression she reserved for challenges. "Yes," she said. He measured a spoonful. Clara took it without flinching and made a face of pure disgust that under other circumstances would have been funny. "Good girl," Peter said, and the warmth in those 2 words was so natural, so unguarded, that Elsie had to turn away and busy herself at the stove. She heard him settle into the chair beside Clara's bed. She heard his voice, low and even, beginning a story. She stopped what she was doing at the stove and listened. He was telling Clara about a Mustang he had come across in the high desert country east of Elko, a gray mare running with a band that no one had been able to catch for going on 3 years. He had tracked the band for 2 days and then stopped. He had not tried to capture her, he had just watched her run. Why? Clara asked. Because some things are worth more wild than kept, he said. Watching something that free changes the way you see everything else. Elsie pressed her hands flat against the warm iron of the stove and stared at the wall. Clara was asleep within the hour. The medicine had done its work. Her breathing was easier, deeper, the cough quieted. Elsie came around the curtain and Peter stood from the chair, and they were closer to each other than they had been before in that small space, close enough that she could see the particular dark quality of his eyes in the lamplight, something between brown and black, like deep creek water over dark stone. "Thank you," she said, quietly enough not to wake Clara. "She will need another dose in the morning," he said just as quietly. He held out the bottle. Their fingers touched this time. Neither of them moved immediately. The lamp threw its warm and unreliable light. The wind outside said nothing useful. Then Peter stepped back and put his hat on and said good night and went back out into the blizzard, and Elsie stood holding the small dark bottle and understanding, with something that felt less like a thought and more like a reckoning, that she was in very serious trouble. She sat down on the edge of Clara's bed and listened to her daughter breathe. "I know," she said to herself, very quietly. "I know." December brought the snow in proper, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms. The horses were working through their indoor routines. The breeding records for the coming spring were being planned. Elsie had taken to spending the evenings in the main house when Clara was settled, working on the books by lamplight in the study while Peter read in the parlor, and they had fallen into a habit of talking across the space between the 2 rooms that was somehow more intimate than sitting in the same room would have been. He asked about Kansas. She told him about Harlow's Creek without making it sad, which required some careful management of the facts, but she managed it. She told him about the seamstress work and the room above the dry goods store and Gerald Potts without naming Potts, because naming Potts would have required explaining Potts, and explaining Potts would have required saying things out loud that she was still not ready to say. He listened without interrupting. This was rarer in a man than it should have been, she had observed. She asked about Nevada. He told her about coming west from Missouri at 22, with enough money to buy a quarter section of land and no experience of ranching, but a fundamental understanding of horses that he traced back to a grandfather in Kentucky. He had built the ranch from that quarter section over 6 years, which was the short version of a story she understood from the books had involved considerable hardship. He did not tell her about the debt. She did not ask. But one evening in December, when the snow was particularly heavy and the fire in the parlor was particularly good, he said, without preamble and without looking at her, "There was a man I trusted 8 years ago who persuaded me to put my name on a document I should not have put my name on." She kept her pen moving on the page. "That sounds like a trap." "It was," he said. "I was 23 and I believed I was making a business arrangement. What I was actually doing was making myself liable for his debts when he absconded." She looked up. He was staring at the fire. "The man's name is Pharaoh," he said. "He runs a network of such arrangements throughout Nevada and Southern California. He finds young men with assets and no experience, and he creates situations that make them legally obligated. By the time I understood what had happened, the debt was already established in a court of law." "How much?" she said. $1,200 originally. I have paid down $700. She thought about the irregular payments. She thought about the below-market sales. She thought about a man spending 6 years paying off a debt incurred through someone else's deliberate fraud. "That is a dark past to carry," she said. "It was my own fault for trusting a stranger." "No," she said. "It was his fault for being someone who did not deserve trust. Those are different things." He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before. Something opened up briefly, like a window in a closed room. He looked away before she could be sure of what she had seen. "The man Dorsey Cal came again last week," he said. She had not known this. He had not told her. What did Pharaoh want this time? He wants to accelerate the payment schedule. He wants $500 by the spring, or he will move to have a lien placed on the ranch property. Elsie set down her pen. $500 against a working ranch's winter cash reserves, with the spring breeding season not yet generating income. $500 was not possible without selling horses below their value again, which would damage the breeding program's reputation, which would reduce future income, which would make the next payment harder. It was a spiral she could see in the numbers as clearly as if it had been drawn there, which was, she realized, exactly the point. This was not just a debt. It was a mechanism designed to consume the ranch. "He wants the property," she said. Peter was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I believe he does." "Then paying him will not end it. He will find another reason for another demand." He looked at her with something that was recognition and resignation in equal measure. "That is my assessment as well." "Then we need another approach." She realized she had said we and could not take it back. He noticed. She saw him notice. He was careful not to make anything of it. "What approach?" he said. "I do not know yet," she said. "But I am good with books and I am good with patterns, and what you have described to me sounds like a pattern he uses more than once. If he has done this to other men in Nevada, there may be a legal remedy that has nothing to do with paying him." She picked up her pen. He watched her for a moment with an expression that was, she thought, something close to wonder, and then he went back to his book. She wrote a letter that night. 2 letters actually. One to the courthouse in Elko and one to the land office in Carson City, both asking routine questions about property records and liens. The kind of questions no one would think twice about from a ranch keeping its books in order. She did not tell Peter she had sent them. She needed to know first if there was anything to find. Christmas came quietly. Elsie had bought Clara a small book of illustrated natural history from the merchant in Elko, ordered weeks ahead, and a set of colored chalks. Clara had made her mother a card with a horse on it that was rendered with a competency surprising in an 8-year-old, and that Elsie pinned to the wall of the cottage and looked at every morning. On Christmas Eve, Peter knocked at the cottage door at dusk. He was carrying 2 wrapped packages, one for Clara and one, he said with a formality that was clearly covering something more uncertain, for Elsie. Clara's package contained a small carved horse, a quarter horse in full gallop, rendered in pale wood with a precision that meant someone had spent real time on it. "Did you make this?" Clara asked him. "Caldwell made it," he said. "He was a woodworker before he came to ranching. I asked him." Clara held it in both hands with a reverence that she normally reserved for books. Elsie's package contained a pair of riding gloves, good leather, well fitted, which told her he had paid attention to the size of her hands at some point when she had not known he was paying attention. "I noticed you had worn through the pair you arrived with," he said. "That is very practical," she said. "It is," he agreed, and there was the almost smile again, more defined now, closer to actual. She went inside and retrieved the gift she had made for him because she had been hoping he would stop by. It was a new cover for the accounts ledger, made from tooled leather she had found in the dry goods store in Elko, with Rattlesnake Creek Ranch worked into the design in a lettering she was proud of. She had spent 3 evenings on it. He took it and held it and looked at it for a long moment. "This is excellent work," he said. "Thank you." He looked up at her. The lamplight from inside the cottage was falling across the space between them, and outside the stars over Nevada were the kind of stars you only got at altitude in winter, impossibly numerous, blazing with a cold and extravagant fire. "You are very talented, Elsie," he said, and it was the first time he had used only her first name and they both heard the shift in it. She said nothing. She could not find something safe to say. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly, and he put his hat on and went back to the main house, and she stood on the porch in the Nevada winter and looked at the stars until she could breathe normally again. January and February passed in a cold and busy brightness. The replies from her courthouse inquiries had come back in early January, and what they told her was more significant than she had hoped. Rutherford Farrow, which was Cal's Farrow's full name, had filed similar liens against 4 other properties in Nevada over the past decade. 3 of those properties he had eventually acquired through foreclosure. One, a cattle operation in Lander County, had fought back through the court system and won, on the grounds that the original contract had been signed under fraudulent misrepresentation. There was a lawyer in Elko named Harvey Sloan who had handled the Lander County case. Elsie wrote to Harvey Sloan. She told Peter about the letters on a February evening when the temperature had finally begun to edge upward and the horses in the paddock were restless with the early intimation of spring. She laid the documents out on the desk in the study and watched his face as he read them. He read through everything. He read slowly and completely, the way he did everything. When he finished, he sat back in the chair and was quiet for a long moment. "You did this on your own," he said. "It was my own time," she said. "The ranch books gave me the pattern. Finding the pattern seemed like part of my job." He looked at her with that open window expression again, and this time it lasted longer before he closed it back up. "I have spent 3 years believing this debt was simply something I had to outlast," he said. "I had not considered that there might be a mechanism to address the root of it." "You were too close to it," she said, "and you were carrying it alone." He looked at the window. Outside, the first evening star was appearing above the western ridge. "Harvey Sloan," he said. "He won the Lander County case on fraud grounds," she said. "The original contract you signed, do you still have it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the locked box where he kept the most sensitive records and took out a document she had never seen, folded and worn at the creases from years of being held and examined and worried over. He laid it on the desk between them. She read it carefully. She read it twice. She was not a lawyer, but she had grown up watching her father, who had been a banker, read contracts, and she had absorbed something about the way deceptive language worked in formal documents, the way it hid its meaning in what it did not say. "Here," she said, and she pointed to a clause in the 4th paragraph. "This says you accept liability for all debts of the partnership, but it does not define the partnership's debts at the date of signing, which means he could have added to them after you signed." Peter leaned over to read where she was pointing. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "That is exactly what he did," he said. "Then that is fraudulent misrepresentation," she said. "The contract was not what he told you it was. Harvey Sloan will know how to proceed." Peter straightened up. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was direct and quiet and completely unguarded. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "Because it is the right thing to do." "That is not an answer," she met his eyes. "Because you have treated me and my daughter with fairness and decency since the day we arrived, and because you are losing a fight you should not have to be fighting alone. That is the answer." He held her gaze for a moment that was long enough to have weight. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Elsie." And she said, "You are welcome, Peter." And they went back to work. But something had changed in the room. Something had been acknowledged without being named, which is sometimes the most honest way a thing can exist before it is ready to be spoken. March came in with a wind that smelled of thaw and possibility. The first mares were showing their spring bellies, and Peter's attention was on the breeding program with an intensity that meant they were in the good part of the year, the part where the work of months was about to produce something real and living and new. Harvey Sloan came out to the ranch on a Wednesday in mid-March, a compact and precise man with a briefcase that looked as though it had accompanied him through many hard rooms. He reviewed the contract and the payment records and the documents Elsie had gathered from the courthouse and the land office, and he spent an hour in conference with Peter in the study while Elsie took Clara out to the paddock. She watched the horses and tried not to listen to the sound of voices from the open window of the study. Clara was leaning on the paddock fence watching a young bay gelding who was showing off, turning tight circles and tossing his head with the beautiful vanity of a young horse who knows he is being watched. "Mama," Clara said. "Yes," Elsie said. Are we staying here? Elsie looked at her daughter. Clara was looking at the gelding. I do not know, Elsie said honestly. I would like to, Clara said, not just because of the horses, although the horses are important. Elsie smiled. What else then? Clara was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was working something out. Mr. Stone told me last week that the mare in the east stall is going to foal in April and that I could come and watch if she is having a good time of it. He said some mares prefer privacy and some do not mind an audience. He would know, Elsie said. He knows a lot about what horses prefer, Clara said. He pays attention to them. Elsie looked at the house. Yes, she said, he does. Clara glanced up at her mother with an expression that was, for an 8-year-old, disconcertingly perceptive. She said nothing further. She turned back to the gelding. Harvey Sloane came out of the main house an hour later with his briefcase and the expression of a man who has found the thing he was looking for. Mrs. Kingsley, he said to Elsie, your identification of that liability clause was exactly correct. The contract was drafted to permit post-signing additions to the partnership debt, which under Nevada law constitutes fraudulent misrepresentation when the additions were made without notification to the other party. We have a strong case. How strong? Peter said. He had come out behind Sloane. Strong enough that I expect Pharaoh to settle rather than face a public proceeding, Sloane said. Men like Pharaoh depend on their arrangements remaining invisible. A court case would expose not just this contract but the pattern of his operations. I believe your ranch hand's wife mentioned she has documents from the Lander County precedent. She is not a ranch hand, Peter said, with a precision that made Harvey Sloane look briefly between Peter and Elsie with an expression of private amusement. She manages the accounts. Of course, Sloane said smoothly. Mrs. Kingsley, those courthouse documents you gathered will be material to the case. I will need copies. I have them ready, she said. Peter was looking at her. She could feel it without looking back. Sloane left with his copies and his briefcase and the expression of a man going into a fight he expected to win, and Elsie and Peter stood in the yard in the March wind, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He will settle, Peter said. I believe so, she said. If he does, the debt is finished. Yes. That would mean the ranch is clear, he said. No more payments to Carson City, no more below-market sales. The breeding program could operate at full capacity. Yes, she said. He turned to look at her directly, and there was something in his face that was working toward expression, building toward it the way weather builds over the mountains. Elsie, he said. Then Clara came flying around the corner of the stable shouting that one of the cats had gotten into the grain store and Peter was needed immediately, and the moment broke like a piece of ice dropped on stone. Peter went to deal with the cat situation. Elsie stood in the yard and looked at the mountains and took several careful breaths. She told herself she was being sensible. She was not entirely successful. April arrived with the first real warmth and the first real color, the meadows below the ranch coming up in a thin and gorgeous green, the creek running high and fast in silver with snowmelt. The foaling season began in earnest, and the ranch moved into the particular high-alert rhythm of those weeks, everyone sleeping lighter, checking on mares at odd hours, the stable becoming the center of gravity for everything. The mare Clara had been told about, a chestnut called Sadie with 3 white stockings, and a temperament that Peter described as opinionated, went into labor on a Thursday afternoon in mid-April. Sadie turned out to be a mare who did not mind an audience, and true to his word, Peter brought Clara to the foaling stall as soon as it was clear things were progressing well. Elsie came too, because Clara wanted her there. They stood at the gate of the foaling stall in the lamplight and straw-sweet air, the 3 of them, and watched the mare work with the focused and ancient competence of her kind. And when the foal came, it came all at once, wet and folded and impossibly improbable, and then it opened its eyes. Clara made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. The foal was copper dark, with a white star on its forehead and 1 white hind sock, and it lay still for a moment gathering itself, and then began the magnificent, effortful, inevitable process of getting to its feet. It fell twice. The third time it stood. Clara was gripping the gate slats with both hands, barely breathing. Peter was standing behind and beside Elsie, close enough that she was aware of his presence as a warmth along her side. She was aware of his breathing. She was aware of how still he was, the particular stillness of someone who has seen this many times and has never stopped finding it worth watching. "It is a filly," he said quietly near her ear. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then in the same quiet tone, "I will let Clara name her." Elsie turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and they were very close in the lamplight. She turned to Clara. "Clara," she said. Clara looked at her mother, eyes shining. "The filly needs a name," Elsie said. "Mr. Stone says you may name her." Clara looked at her with an expression of enormous responsibility. And then Peter said something that Elsie had not expected, something that arrived without warning and hit her somewhere she had not known was undefended. He said it quietly, looking not at Clara but at Elsie, with a steadiness in his eyes that told her it was not a casual statement. He said, "Pick any name for that foal, because your mama deserves the choice." Elsie stopped breathing. He was not talking only about the foal's name, and they both knew it. He was talking about the months of choices that had been taken from her. Kansas and the creditors and Gerald Potts and the misdelivered letter that she had turned into a desperate gamble. He was talking about the fact that she had arrived at his ranch with no guarantee of anything, and had built something here out of work and intelligence and quiet courage, and that a woman who had done that deserved to be the one choosing what came next. Clara said, "I will think about it carefully," with the seriousness of someone who understood that some things required proper consideration. And Elsie turned away from Peter and pressed her hands flat against her thighs because they were shaking, and she thought about the dark past he had shared with her in December firelight, and the hidden debt, and the trap Pharaoh had laid for him, and the secrets they had each been carrying when they arrived at this ranch on opposite sides of a professional arrangement. And she understood with a clarity that left her nowhere to hide that she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Peter Stone. The question was what to do about it. What she did, initially, was nothing. She went back to the cottage that night and lay awake listening to Clara breathe and thinking about the shape of what her life had become, so different from the life she had expected, and about whether she was someone who was allowed to want something this large. She had arrived here as a widow with a child and nothing much else, and she had built a functional life from those materials, and the functional life had grown, imperceptibly, into something that felt like home. And at the center of that feeling, she had to admit, was not just the cottage and the mountains and the horses and even Clara's happiness, but a man who kept soup warm for sick people without being asked, and who told horses' stories to sick children, and who had spent 6 years alone carrying a fraudulent debt with a dignity that had never curdled into self-pity. She was 30 years old now. It was 1883, and she had been a seamstress and a widow and an accidental ranch accountant, and she had not let herself want something personal and large since Henry died. She thought it was possibly time to reconsider that policy. But she did nothing immediately, because she was practical and the moment needed to settle. The legal matter with Pharaoh moved quickly once Sloan filed the initial documents with the court in Elko. As Sloan had predicted, Pharaoh's response was to negotiate rather than face a public proceeding, and by the end of April the terms were being discussed in writing, which was apparently something Pharaoh did not normally believe in, but had been persuaded was necessary by the evidence assembled against him. Dorsey Cal came to the ranch once more during this period, on a cold April morning, and this time his visit was not menacing but sullen, the manner of a man whose leverage had been substantially reduced. He spoke to Peter in the yard, and Elsie watched from the window of the main house. She saw Peter's body language, which was different from the previous visits. Steady, not aggressive but not retreating either. The body language of a man who knows the ground beneath him is solid. Cal left within 10 minutes. Peter came inside and found Elsie at the study desk. He was here to assess whether we would settle early for a lesser amount, Peter said. I told him to wait for Sloane's response. Good, she said. He sat down across the desk from her, which he did not normally do. Normally he read in the parlor while she worked, and he looked at her for a moment with something he was clearly working toward. I want to ask you something, he said. All right, she said. When your arrangement here is complete, he said carefully, what did you plan to do? She looked at him. The question was exactly as loaded as he had intended it to be, and he was not pretending otherwise. My arrangement here, she said, matching his care, was always open-ended. There was no specified term. I know, he said. I am asking what you wanted, not what the arrangement said. She set down her pen. She looked at him across the desk, at the dark, serious eyes and the quiet face and the man she had been learning, layer by layer, for 8 months. I wanted somewhere safe for Clara, she said. I wanted work that was worth doing. I wanted to not be afraid of Gerald Potts or anyone like him. Those are things you already have, he said. Yes, she said. So I am asking again, he said. What do you want now? She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the study window, the April wind was moving through the meadow grass, and the mountains were wearing their last snow with a careless splendor. I think you know what I want, she said quietly. I would rather hear you say it. Peter, she said. Elsie, he said, and the way he said her name was nothing like the way he had said it in December. It was different now, warmer and more certain, like a door being opened rather than tested. She came around the desk. He stood up. They were face to face in the small study with the account books around them and the smell of coffee from the kitchen and the distant sound of horses in the paddock. And Elsie Kingsley put her hand flat against Peter Stone's chest, over his heart, which she could feel beating with a rapidity that suggested he was not as composed as he appeared. I want to stay, she said, not as your accountant. He covered her hand with his. He was looking at her with that fully open expression, no door, no distance, just him. I am not entirely experienced at this, he said. I want to be honest with you. Neither am I, she said. I was married young and I loved my husband, and then he was gone, and I have been managing since then, not living. I do not know exactly how to do this either. Then we will figure it out together, he said. That seems reasonable, she said. He brought his other hand up to the side of her face, gently, and the gentleness of it, after months of careful professional distance, was enough to make her close her eyes. He kissed her softly, briefly, with a restraint that said this was a beginning rather than a conclusion. When she opened her eyes, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face, something entirely unguarded and entirely certain. I was not looking for this, he said. Neither was I, she said. That seems to be the nature of it. He smiled. A full smile, not the shadow of one, the real thing, and it transformed his face into something she wanted to keep looking at for a very long time. Outside, Clara could be heard asking Caldwell the name of the Tuesday horse, which was what she called the bay gelding who turned his best side to the fence on Tuesdays for reasons no one had been able to determine. Should we tell Clara? Peter said. Clara has known for months, Elsie said. She is very perceptive. He laughed, which was also a new sound from him, genuine and warm and entirely undefended. I suppose we should go tell her officially, he said. I suppose we should, Elsie said. They walked out of the main house together into the April sunlight, and Clara looked up from her conversation with Caldwell with an expression that was entirely unsurprised and deeply satisfied. I have decided on the foal's name, she announced. What is it? Peter asked. Ember, Clara said, because she is the color of a fire going down at the end of the night when it is still warm, but it has gone from wild to quiet. There was a silence. That is an excellent name, Peter said. I thought so, Clara said, with a modesty that was entirely performative. Elsie took her daughter's hand and pressed it, and Clara squeezed back. And above them, the Nevada sky was the specific blue that only existed at high altitude in April, enormous and clear and completely certain. The settlement with Faro came through in May. Sloane had negotiated with considerable skill, and the terms were stark. The debt was voided on fraud grounds. The payments already made were not recoverable, but no further payments were owed, and Pharaoh was to cease all contact with Peter or face a full civil proceeding with the additional Lander County precedent as supporting evidence. Pharaoh signed. Peter came to find Elsie in the cottage garden, where she was planting the kitchen herbs she had ordered from the seed catalog in February. He held out the document. She read it twice. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with something she did not try to suppress. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. 6 years. "You carried that alone for 6 years," she said. "I know," he said. He was looking at her with the quiet certainty that had become familiar. "I do not intend to carry things alone anymore." She put down her trowel and stood up, and he took her hands, garden dirt and all, and they stood in the May sunshine among her half-planted herbs while the Rattlesnake Creek Ranch went about its business around them with a cheerful indifference to their moment. He proposed to her properly on an evening in June, not with elaborate ceremony but with a directness that was entirely him, asking her on the porch of the cottage after Clara was asleep, with the midsummer stars overhead and the creek in the distance and the horses quiet in the paddock. He told her he had thought carefully about how to do this correctly. He told her he had spoken to Clara first, which Elsie had not known, and that Clara's response had been that she would require a horse of her own, which was negotiable. Elsie laughed until she had to sit down. "Is that a yes?" he said, and he was laughing too, and the sound of it was one of the best sounds she had ever heard. "Yes," she said. "Very much yes." He kissed her again, less briefly this time, and the Nevada night wrapped around them with its stars and its sage and its ancient and indifferent beauty, and Elsie Kingsley felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, entirely and safely held. They were married in August, 1 year after her arrival at Rattlesnake Creek. The ceremony was performed in Elko by the Justice of the Peace, attended by Harvey Sloan and his wife, by Caldwell, who wore a suit that was clearly not his own, and by Joe Marsh, who cried openly and without embarrassment and said he was not crying, he had something in his eye, which he maintained even after it had been going on for 20 minutes. Clara stood beside her mother in a dress Elsie had made for the occasion, white cotton with blue ribbon trim, and she held the small carved horse that Caldwell had made her at Christmas, and she looked at her mother and Peter with an expression of profound approval. Peter wore his best shirt and his second-best hat, and he looked at Elsie when she walked in with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, an expression of such complete and open love that it made the world behind him go temporarily uncertain. The Justice of the Peace said the words. They said theirs back. Peter put a ring on her finger, a simple band of gold that had been his mother's, and that he had been keeping in the locked box with the ledger for reasons he had not previously examined. When the justice said they were married, Joe Marsh let out a whoop that echoed off the walls of the office, and Caldwell said, "Hush, Joe," with no noticeable effect. They went back to the ranch and had a dinner that Joe and Caldwell had prepared in secret. A genuinely impressive spread that included a pie that Joe admitted he had learned from his mother in Tennessee, and that Clara declared the finest pie she had ever consumed. In the evening, Elsie and Peter sat on the porch of the main house, which was now their home, and looked at the ranch in the August dusk, the horses in the paddock and the mountains darkening against the last of the light, and Ember, who was now 4 months old and had the particular bouncing energy of a foal discovering the scale of the world, running the length of the paddock fence with an abandon that made everyone who watched her want to laugh. "I want to ask you something," Elsie said. "All right," he said. "When you said pick any name for the foal because your mama deserves the choice," she said, "what were you saying exactly?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the paddock. "I was saying," he said carefully, "that you had come here with no choices and you had made everything possible through your own ability and courage, and that the least the world owed you was the chance to have the things you wanted without asking permission. The foal was the smallest version of that idea, but I meant the larger one." She was quiet. "I was saying," he continued, That I wanted you to stay because you wanted to, not because you had to. That if you chose to love this place and, he paused, and me, it would be because you chose it, not because you had no other option. She looked at him. You were giving me the choice, she said. Yes, he said. You deserve all of them. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at Ember running in the dusk, and the mountains going dark, and the first stars appearing, and she felt the word home settle into her with the permanence of something that has always been true and has only just been said. The following year brought abundance. The breeding program, freed from the financial drain of Pharaoh's fraudulent debt, expanded properly for the first time. Peter brought on a third ranch hand, a serious young man named Anders who had come west from Minnesota and who turned out to have a gift for working with the young horses in training. The reputation of Rattlesnake Creek horses began to spread, and buyers came from as far as Sacramento and Denver, and the prices they paid were what the horses were actually worth. Clara, now 9 and then 10, became what Peter called the ranch's official historian, keeping a journal of the horses' personalities and histories with a thoroughness that Peter read and took genuine note of. Her small carved horse from Caldwell sat on the windowsill of her room, which was now properly hers in the main house, where she had moved with her mother and stepfather in August. She had offered to call him father. Peter had said she could call him whatever she was comfortable with, that there was no obligation. She had considered this for a full week, and then announced she would call him Papa Peter, which was specific enough to be accurate and warm enough to be true, and which she continued to use for the rest of her life. Clara's relationship with the horses deepened in the way that some children's relationships with animals do, into something more than fondness and closer to fluency. She could read a horse's mood at 20 feet, and she understood instinctively the things Peter had always known. That patience is faster than force. That trust is built from small and consistent honesty. When she was 10, Peter gave her a horse of her own, negotiated from Caldwell's best yearling, a roan filly who was not Ember but who had Ember's intelligence. Clara named her Prospect, which she said meant something she was looking forward to, which was a name that made Peter smile for the rest of the day. In the autumn of that year, 1884, Elsie told Peter she was expecting. He had been in the stable when she told him, checking on a mare who had been off her feed, and he straightened up and turned to look at her with an expression that moved through surprise and then into something so openly and unself-consciously joyful that she laughed. "When?" he said. "April," she said. He crossed the stable in 3 strides and took her hands and then thought better of that and held her instead, carefully, with the same consideration he applied to everything that mattered to him. "April," he said, into her hair. "Clara will want to name this one too," she said. "She will have to negotiate," he said, and she could feel him smiling against the top of her head. The winter of 1884 was a good one by Nevada standards, which meant it was cold and white and demanded respect, but did not turn brutal. The main house was warm and full in a way it had not been before, Clara doing her lessons at the kitchen table, while Elsie kept the books and Peter came in at midday with cold reddened hands and the look of a man who has been doing work he believes in. In the evenings they read. Clara was a relentless reader, books ordered from the catalog in Elko and borrowed from the small lending library the Methodist Church maintained, and she read aloud to both her parents in the evenings with an expressiveness that suggested she was performing rather than reading, which she was. Peter had begun to tell his own stories. Not the contained and careful statements of information he had offered in the early months, but real stories from before the ranch, from Missouri and the road west, the year he had spent in Wyoming before coming to Nevada, the horses he had known, and the country he had traveled through. He was not a natural storyteller in the performative sense, but he was a precise and honest one, and when he described a thing you saw it clearly. Elsie listened to these stories with a particular attention, because they were filling in the years before she had known him, making the man she loved more fully dimensional in her understanding, and she found that each story made her love him more, which she had not thought was possible but which turned out to be entirely the nature of this kind of love. The baby came in April of 1885, a boy, born on the first proper warm morning of the spring with the creek running full and the first wildflowers coming up in the meadow. He was large and loud and entirely himself from the first moment, dark-haired like his father, with Elsie's gray eyes, and he regarded the world with a suspicion that softened over the first hours into a watchful interest. They named him Thomas. Clara, who had been permitted to be present for the birth along with the midwife from Elko, held him for the first time with an expression of concentrated wonder, supporting his head with the careful attentiveness she brought to everything that required care. "He looks like Papa Peter," she announced. "He does," Elsie agreed from the bed, exhausted and radiant. Peter was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Elsie's hand, looking at Thomas in Clara's arms with an expression that had nothing behind it and nothing hidden, just an open and uncomplicated love for his son and for the room and for the people in it. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly. Thomas opened his eyes and stared at nothing in particular with the vague philosophical intensity of the newly arrived, and Peter laughed softly. "He is judging all of us," Clara said. "He comes by it honestly," Elsie said, and Peter squeezed her hand. In the summer of 1885, the Rattlesnake Creek Ranch hosted its first annual open sale, an event that Elsie had proposed in the winter and that Peter had thought about for a week before agreeing to. It was an open day where buyers could come to the ranch directly, see the horses in their working environment rather than at a sale barn, watch them in the paddock and the training ring, and purchase directly. Joe Marsh, who had unexpectedly developed a talent for hospitality, organized the food. Caldwell built a viewing stand beside the main training ring. Anders worked with the horses to ensure they were at their best, and the event drew 43 buyers from 3 states. Ember ran the paddock demonstration with a freedom and speed that made people stop talking. She was a yearling now, copper-dark and blazing, and she ran with the remembered joy of that first night in the foaling stall translated into something long-legged and magnificent. A man from Sacramento offered $300 for her. Elsie said no. Peter, who had been standing beside her, said nothing, because he had known what the answer would be. Clara, who had heard the offer from the fence, looked at her mother with an expression of pure relief. "She is not for sale," Elsie told the man pleasantly. The sale was a success by any measure that mattered. The reputation of the ranch was established in a new and firmer way. The prices reflected the quality of the horses. The books, which Elsie still kept, told a story of a ranch operating in the open air of its own possibility. In the evenings after the buyers had gone and the hands had put the horses up, and the ranch was quiet in its summer dusk, Elsie and Peter sat on the porch with Thomas between them on a blanket, working on the project of sitting up with the focused determination of a 9-month-old who has decided this is the skill that matters most. Clara was at the paddock fence with Prospect, grooming her in the long evening light, the horses head down and quiet in the patient way of horses who trust who is touching them. "I want to add a second breeding stallion," Peter said, looking at the paddock. "I know," Elsie said. "I have been thinking about the same thing. The income projections support it if we bring him in for the next season. There is a horse in Sacramento I have been writing to a man about," he said. "A registered thoroughbred quarter cross who has an excellent competition record. I think he could change the line." "Let me see the correspondence," she said, "and the breeding records. I want to see what the bloodlines look like mapped against what we have." "I will bring them inside tonight," he said. Thomas chose this moment to succeed at sitting up for a full 3 seconds before toppling sideways onto the blanket with an expression of pure astonishment at the failure. Both his parents reached for him simultaneously. Their hands met over him, catching him before he could be upset by the fall. Thomas looked up at both of them and appeared to decide the situation was acceptable. "Again," Clara called from the fence, having apparently been watching. "Give him a moment," Elsie called back. "He will want to try immediately," Peter said quietly. "He has a very specific personality." "He has your tenacity," Elsie said. "He has your determination," Peter said. "Those are different things." She looked at him. He was watching Thomas with an expression of absorbed love, the kind of love that had nothing to prove and nowhere to go, the settled kind. She thought about the woman who had opened a misdelivered letter in a room above a dry goods store in Kansas and thought, desperate and practical and terrified, that she might as well take the chance. She thought about the man who had come out to meet a wagon in his yard in August of 1883, with nothing on his face except careful assessment, and an old sorrow he was carrying alone. She thought about soup on a porch in September, and riding gloves at Christmas, and a foaling stall in April lamplight, and a contract on a desk between two people who were not yet sure what they were to each other but who were already, without knowing it, building the foundation of something that would hold. She thought about the hidden motive that had turned out to be no hidden motive at all, just a man with a secret debt and a private shame, and the kind of integrity that pays its obligations even when the obligations were never honestly incurred. She thought about the forbidden feeling she had talked herself out of for months, the warmth she kept trying to be practical about, the way his name had started to feel different when she thought it. She thought about the moment in the barn when he had said, with everything unspoken made suddenly and simply spoken, "Pick any name for that foal because your mama deserves the choice." "Peter," she said. "Elsie," he said. She took his hand. Thomas regarded their joined hands with the judicious attention he applied to everything, and apparently found it satisfactory. "I am very glad the letter was misdelivered," she said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the meadow. "So am I," he said. Every day. Ember ran along the paddock fence in the long light, and Prospect stood quiet under Clara's hands, and the mountains held their ancient shapes against the evening sky, and the creek spoke its continuous and silver sentence, and the Rattlesnake Creek ranch settled into the particular peace that belongs to a place where things have been earned. The second stallion, whose name in his papers was Sterling Prince but whom they called Prince for daily purposes, arrived in October and proved to be everything the correspondence had suggested. He was intelligent and cooperative, and he and the resident stallion, a dark chestnut called Revenue, established a working coexistence that Peter managed with the attentiveness he gave all horse relationships. Clara, who was now 11, and who had developed opinions about bloodlines that the ranch hands had learned to take seriously, spent a week watching Prince in the paddock, and then wrote a 4-page assessment in her journal that Peter read carefully and told her was excellent work. This sent Clara into the kind of focused pleasure that Elsie recognized as her daughter being entirely herself, which was the most beautiful thing Elsie had ever had the opportunity to witness. The following spring brought another foaling season, and this one was the best they had had. Prince's first foals were exceptional, strong and well-built and quick to train, and the buyers who came in the summer for the second annual sale left the ranch with horses they spoke about to other people, which was the best kind of advertising. Thomas, now walking with a thoroughness that made everyone need to watch where they stepped, had developed a personality that was best described as an unignorable combination of his father's quiet determination and his mother's practical intelligence applied to the single question of what was worth investigating. The answer appeared to be everything. He had no fear of the horses, which was both gratifying and concerning. Peter began his education in the same way he had begun Clara's, at 4-stall length, and with a serious conversation about what horses could tell you with their ears. Elsie watched this from the stable door, as she had watched the earlier version of it, and felt the same complicated warmth in her chest, deeper now, more certain. She was 32 years old and she was running a ranch in Nevada, and she had 2 children and a husband who said her name like it was a complete sentence. And she had chosen all of it, every piece of it with her own full and deliberate choosing, and it was the right life, the true life, hers. In the evenings when the books were done and the horses were settled, and Clara was reading her brother a story with the expressive competence of someone who has been performing narrative for years, Elsie and Peter sat on the porch and talked about the things they were building toward: the third stallion someday, the expanded paddock they had been planning, the kitchen garden she wanted to double in size, the spring where she had been watching a pair of red-tailed hawks build a nest for the second year running. He told her things he had not yet told her. There was always more, with a man who had learned to open slowly. She told him things she had not yet told him. There was always more, with a woman who had learned to trust only after trust had been earned. And there was always more to love, which was the part that still surprised her, 2 years into their marriage, which was that the thing kept growing rather than settling. She had thought love was a destination. She had discovered it was a direction. In the autumn of 1886, Elsie found that she was expecting again. She told Peter on the porch at dusk, as she had told him the first time, and his response was the same uncomplicated joy. And she laughed again, and he held her again. And Thomas, who was now 18 months old and had been sitting between them, looked up at both of them with the assessing intelligence that was becoming the defining feature of his personality, and then went back to studying a pinecone he had found interesting. Clara, told at dinner, received the news with a warm practicality that was entirely her. She said she hoped it was another boy because she had enough experience with Thomas to have useful information to offer. Peter said she would be invaluable regardless. Clara said she knew. The baby came in the spring of 1887, a girl this time, with Elsie's coloring and what Peter swore was Clara's expression right from the first hour. They named her Margaret after nobody in particular, because it was a name they both liked the sound of. Clara held her with the same concentrated wonder she had brought to Thomas, and Thomas regarded his sister with a philosophical uncertainty that gradually resolved itself, over the following weeks, into a protective interest that manifested primarily as an insistence on standing between her and the horse paddock, which was a precaution that reflected both his nature and his upbringing. Ember, now 4 years old and fully herself, a copper-dark and blazing horse with an intelligence that made her a favorite of every visitor who came to the ranch, ran her morning circles in the paddock while the household woke, a daily and reliable joy. Clara watched her from the fence one morning in May with Margaret on her hip and Thomas beside her, the 3 of them in a row, and Elsie came to stand with them and looked at the horse that bore a name Clara had chosen on a night that had changed everything. Ember was a good name, Elsie said. I knew it would be, Clara said without false modesty, and Elsie smiled and put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and they watched the horse run. Peter came from the stable and stood beside Elsie, closed the way he always stood, and she leaned into him without thinking about it because it had become as natural as breathing. Thomas pointed at Ember with the authority of a child who has decided something important. Fast, he said. Very fast, Peter agreed. Me, Thomas said. Not yet, Peter said. But someday. Thomas considered this and found it acceptable. The mountains in the distance wore the morning light with their usual indifference and grandeur. The creek ran its silver argument with the stones. The horses in the far paddock grazed with their heads down and their tails moving in the May breeze. The Nevada sky was the blue that existed only here, only at this altitude, only on mornings like this one. Elsie stood between her husband and her daughter, with her youngest on Clara's hip and her son pressing against her leg, and she felt the fullness of the life she had built from a misdelivered letter and a desperate chance, and the specific courage of a woman who had nothing left to lose and therefore everything to gain. She thought about the girl in Kansas who had stood at the post office box and opened an envelope addressed to someone else and read 3 lines that had changed the direction of everything. She thought, thank you, not to Kansas or to the mistake or to the circumstances that had taken her husband and her home and her certainty, to the part of herself that had not given up, to the part that had written back, to the part that had looked at a man standing in a yard in August and had thought, under all her wariness and practicality, "This is someone worth knowing." She had known herself right. The ranch would grow. The horses would run. Clara would become everything she was clearly going to become. Thomas would be stubborn and capable and surprising. Margaret would find her own particular and exact self in time. And Ember would run the paddock for years yet, copper-dark in the Nevada mornings, bearing the name of a fire going down to warm, quiet coals. And in the evenings, on the porch, in the good particular piece of a life that had been chosen and was being built, Elsie Kingsley would sit with Peter Stone, and they would look at what they had made together, and it would be enough, and it would be more than enough, and it would go on being enough for all the years ahead of them, which were many, and which were theirs. The foreman's cottage had a light in its window still, because Caldwell lived there now, and sometimes in the evenings when Elsie saw it she thought of the woman who had arrived there with a child and a worn suitcase and a hope she had not quite let herself name. She thought, that woman got everything she was hoping for. She thought, and more. And above the ranch, the Nevada stars appeared one by one in their extravagant and ancient certainty, and the last light went from copper to rose to the purple deep of a high-country night, and somewhere in the paddock Ember ran one last circle in the dusk, just because she could.